Hello. My name is Patricia. I'm from the University Hamburg, and I'm very excited to chair the panel about the feminist perspective on the Russian-Ukrainian war. We will have 4 authors and 1 discussant. Our discussant is Victoria Scheyer from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Victoria, you are joining us online, so can you just for a second say hello and confirm that you can hear us?
Hi, yes, welcome. I can hear you very well. Thanks for the kind introduction, and hello to all the panelists.
Hello, Victoria. Thank you very much. We will change a bit the terms of the paper. We will start with Cornelia Ulbert, who is the author of Venus or Mars, How Gender Stereotypes Affect War and Peace. Cornelia, you are from the Institute for Development and Peace at Duisburg. We will then jump to Simone Wysocki, who is from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, and will give us an input about Up in Arms, weapons supply, arms export, and militarization from a feminist foreign policy perspective. Simone, you are online as well. Could you just say hello to us?
Yes, hello and good afternoon from my side as well.
Thank you very much, Simone. We will then proceed with Hanna Manoilenko. She is at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, and the title of her paper is Women's Experiences and Responses to Russian War in Ukraine. And we will end around with Annick Wibben from the Swedish University Stockholm, whose paper title is Feminist Foreign and Security Policy During Wartime in Ukraine. I would say, Cornelia, the floor is yours. We have to share the screen. Just start and then I think we have to open. Oh, it's open. Okay, it's nothing already. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
So, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot also to especially Simone and Victoria, who organized this panel, because as I understood it correctly, Yanis encouraged them to do so. And thanks that I am also part of this panel now. Thanks to all of you after the lunch break, and I'm really glad that the room is still quite full for Saturday afternoon. I will talk about Venus or Mars, how gender stereotypes affect war and peace. And I have to admit, I took up my old engagement with questions of gender and security when we were writing a chapter in the Friedensgutachten, this year's Friedensgutachten, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. And I have to admit, I was so frustrated. And then out of this frustration, I wrote a little blog, and then I developed it into a bit longer paper. And I'm very glad I only came here today, and I was in 2 panels this morning. And in both panels, speakers were talking about masculinity. And although I was quite frustrated, but I thought feminist approaches are so neglected in international relations, especially here in Germany. I'm glad that 2 speakers, male speakers, talked about masculinity this morning. So I will start. Thanks a lot. Okay, I will talk about Venus or Mars. What's gender got to do with it in IR? And it's without a question mark. Then I talk about gender stereotypes and power relations, how they establish political authority. I will talk about masculine leaders, mainly states, and the war in Ukraine. And I will end up with conclusions for theorizing in IR and for policy making. So Venus on Mars, what's gender got to do with IR? I took this picture. It's Peter Paul Rubens, dating of about 1630, to show you it's quite old, the stereotyping. Venus, the woman standing for peace or love, and Mars, the god of war. And I started with in my paper because I wanted to show you it's not only an authoritarian or autocratic state like Russia that dwells on gender stereotypes. It's also quite common in politics, also between friends. Because Robert Kagan, after the war on terrorism started, he wrote a piece about power and weakness. And you can read the quotes. He equated Europe with weakness because it refrained from military power, and the US with power because they still stuck to military power. And why does this work? And I don't want to use gender stereotypes as an explanation of the individual behavior of politicians like Putin or Trump. It's about showing on the causes and consequences gender stereotyping really has on a societal and thus also on a political level. You can see I put a note. It was an old table here. So what's deemed as masculine, what's deemed as feminine. You can see feminine. It's not only women; it's also other groups that are seen as weak and feminine. I won't go too deep into detail because of time, because I want to focus on other aspects as well. Why was it play out in politics, and how does it play out in politics? I would argue, as many others, gender stereotypes are used to legitimize your political position and also establish political authority by this, because it does work. Because social practices of gender hierarchies are culturally embedded in symbolically assigning the male to the public sphere and the female to the private sphere. That's not new, but it's also institutionalized by the male activity of killing and the masculinized nature of war, versus assigning care to women and connotating peace as feminine. Simone will also talk about it in her presentation. So the hypermasculine behavior is used as a claim to power. And it's not only Putin. We had a lot of examples during the last years. It's Trump, it's Bolsonaro, it's Erdogan, to cite other leaders, not only Putin. And this is successful because, as I said, roles are culturally widely accepted in all societies, and it's often justified on religious grounds. So it starts with the image of a masculine leader. That's quite iconic. We all know this picture. But we didn't think about it seriously. What does it mean, this picture? We only looked at pictures, and I will come back in my conclusions why this is a problem for us, that we only look at pictures and ridicule Putin, because we couldn't open the black box like others who speak Russian and Ukraine to tell us what's really happening in the society. So I looked into, I only refer to it. I can't present it because it's not my studies. But there are researchers who are proficient in Russian and Ukraine. They can read the documents, they can follow the discussions, and they did real good empirical research. What happened during the last, especially 20 years in Russia. And they can tell you and show you with many examples what happened and how the masculine behavior of one individual translated into a masculine notion of your own nation and how this played out in politics. And especially one author, Elizabeth Wood, she's talking about Putin's scenario of power, which is constituted through a set of political messages, conveyed as much through symbolism, signals, ceremonies, and rituals, as through texts and doctrines. We only, as I said before, usually we only notice it with the pictures we see, because we can't understand what's really happening there. But it operates on different levels, not only in the visual level, but also interpersonal and verbal. Putin denouncing other especially in life situations, denouncing people, and he's the absolute emperor in Russia. And as long as we were talking about it before, as long as he is in power, then everything will be okay in Russia. That's the narrative. But why is it the narrative? Because it leads, as I said, it's not just the behavior of one individual, it leads to a conception of a manly state. And for years in Russia, there has been the narrative that it's a unique Eurasian civilization that is superior to the European civilization of gay Europa, because homophobia is also part of this hypermasculinity. So degeneration is an integral part of the development towards a Western-style liberal democracy. That's the narrative. And you have to counter it somehow, because it's a danger to Russian identity, to the Russian identity of Ukraine. And this was also used as a justification for the invasion of Russia. But however, I would say the hypermasculine stylization of Russia and the narrative of a degenerated Ukraine also had the consequences that Russia overestimated, and we also, the West, overestimated its military strength on the one hand, and we underestimated the power of the Ukrainian resistance because we didn't look into it. So what does this mean for theorizing in international relations? The thing is, gender hierarchies can only be constructed on the basis of inequalities. And these inequalities are fed by deep-rooted power imbalances on various levels. So the power balances are due to gender, sexuality, religion, ethnic descent, or nationality. And what we have to do is give up the idea that we can do research with this neat departmentalization of different levels of analysis. That's not possible, because we have to shift from this interstate relations conception we have towards the a conception of relational agents embedded in gendered and racialized hierarchies. And this makes up international relations. And my second plea would also be to engage more with area studies, and not just as a kind of auxiliary discipline. It should be an earnest engagement with area studies. So what does this also mean for theorizing in feminist research? I would say explore the concept of hegemonic masculinity and its potential for change, because we only looked at it, how was power established, but there's also potential for change in this concept if you change it. And I found it quite interesting. Shortly after the outbreak of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Claudius Seidel in the FAZ, and it's in German, the quote said, das völlig zerstörte Image. Wladimir Putin hat den Wettbewerb der Bilder verloren. Männlich stark entschlossen wird nicht ein anderer. And I picked the two photos because that's quite iconic as well. Putin sitting on his own table, and there you see Zelensky sitting around a table with food. He's the caring leader. He's not the leader with a distance, but he's in between and he's caring. So there's some slightly reframing of the concept of masculinity that happened. And I don't know what will happen, but you see there is potential for change. Conclusions for policy making, and Annik will talk about it in more detail, is new foreign security approaches are needed, full stop, or exclamation mark. Because the feminist foreign policy, with its focus on social justice and gender equity, can facilitate change, because it asks us to look at power imbalances in society. And the second thing I learned by reading, especially the research of there's an excellent book by Valerie Sperling. You have to foster a vital civil society to counter the images of hypermasculinity as a narrative for establishing political authority. Because if you have a vital civil society that counters the kind of patriarchal conceptions in a society, it makes it easier to delegitimize hypermasculinist leader. And the ultimate goal in the end on a really political level must be to overcome thinking and judging in the binary categories of male and female. And interestingly, in sociology, there's a wide debate about giving up the binary categories and how it might happen, and that it already happens in some segments of society. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. We will now proceed with Simone. Simone, would you like to share a screen, or are you just...
No, I'm fine. Thank you. Do not have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, then I get started. I take you to another setting. I'm going to talk about up in arms, weapon supply, arms exports, and militarization from a feminist foreign policy perspective. And I'm going to start first a little bit what Cornelia has already been referred to, the relationship between feminism, pacifism, and war. And there's a dichotomy between women's peace and men's war. This has been dominant in Western and also other cultures. And this dichotomy can be identified in politics, media, and education. Women are portrayed as inherently peaceful and nurturing, while men are being depicted as courageous warriors. And this also includes the rather banal argument that peace is a women's issue. The debate over whether or not women have a feminine, peaceful nature, for example, through their motherhood, remains virulent and serves as a stereotypical image of perpetuating the public-private dichotomy. Such essentialist and biologist arguments can be identified in democracies, also in other states or governmental formats. But in democracy, for example, in conservative circles, but also in radical right populist politics, where beautiful souls, quote, concentrate on their nature-given role of nurturers, mothers, and wives. Feminism and also the transnational women's movement are not unified when it comes to the question of women, pacifism, and war. Even within liberal feminism, there are different positions. Some have nurtured the argument of essential peacefulness of women and argue for pacifism. Others demand equal rights for women joining the military, for example. This is just one example. And when you look at the history of women's movement, there are many examples of women resisting war and the preparation of war. For example, the women of Greenham Common during the Cold War in fighting UK nuclear weapons, or the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm sure Vicky is going to talk about them as well. So my second thought I want to share with you is the thought on feminist solidarity with Ukrainian aims of self-defense. So the question about up in arms. And when you look at the history of the women's movement, but also on feminist research, there's a vast number of examples where women have joined armed resistance movements. And feminist research since the 1980s has also traced women in armed resistances. This growing body of research highlights the multiple and sometimes also contradictory roles occupied by women as both agents and victims of violence. During independence struggles such as in Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, or South Africa, women held roles as fighters, organizers, and supporters. In Vietnam, El Salvador, and Peru, women took an active part in guerrilla warfare in an effort to overthrow the regimes. More recently, the women's defense units in Rojava, northern Syria, helped to liberate regions from the oppressive ISIS terror. However, feminist research also indicates that women are rarely found in leadership roles within armed resistance movements and are expected to fade back into private domestic spheres after the conflict has ended, rather than becoming any roles in the latter political affairs of rebuilding their countries. Liberal pacifist feminist rejection of women's violence fails to qualitatively distinguish between statist, colonialist, imperialist, interventionist militarism, and the legitimate right to individual and collective self-defense. Such right can be found in some feminist post-colonial theorizing, for example. And I take you to one example. It's the feminist theoretical foundation of the Kurdish women's movement, genealogy. It's a form of feminism which postulates a women-centered philosophy of self-defense as part of gender equality and situates this philosophy in an intersectional analysis of colonialism, racism, capitalism, and patriarchy. The theory of the rose holds that while women may look fragile, they have thorns to protect themselves. And this is really a very brief glimpse of a very rich philosophy, which I found personally very interesting. The right to resistance and self-defense can also be identified in Ukrainian feminist thinking. Ukrainian feminists drafted, for example, a manifesto on the right to resist the Russian aggression and asked for worldwide as well as for feminist solidarity as an act of, quote, political practice which must listen to the voices of those directly affected by the imperialist aggression. And I think this is a very feminist aim per se. The Ukrainian feminist points also to the fact that they have been and continue to fight, quote again, systematic discrimination, patriarchy, racism, and capitalist exploitation. However, the Russian invasion makes it inevitable to join the general defense effort of the Ukrainian society to fight for survival, for basic human rights, and also for political self-determination. And I give you another quote of this Ukrainian feminist manifesto. Abstract pacifism, which condemns all sides taking part in the war, leads to irresponsible solutions in practice. We insist on the essential difference between violence as a means of oppression and as a legitimate means of self-defense. And last but not least, the manifesto also points to President Putin's political attempt to criminalize LGBTIQ people and to decriminalize domestic violence by deleting existing laws. Let me take you to my last point, which is why Germany needs a restrictive arms export control law as part of its feminist foreign policy. The Russian invasion in Ukraine has led to a change in times, to the so-called Zeitenwende, and to a final end of the European peace order, which has been built in concert with Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union. What we can see, or what we've been seeing in the last decade, was a massive worldwide, but also dominant Western military build-up, which has taken place over the course of the last decade. In a recent hearing of the Ministry of Economics in Germany, related to the plans to establish a German arms export control law, arms industry lobbyists openly asked to abandon this whole initiative. And this is a result of this so-called change in times. Well, this is not only a blunt rejection of a political effort promised in the coalition agreement, it also fails to recognize that arming Ukraine and asking for a truly restrictive German arms export policy are two sides of the same coin. To secure the international order, of which the United Nations Charter is a key part. Peace and security can only be achieved through arms control and disarmament. And the second initiative, which is taking place at the moment, is the feminist foreign policy, the drafting of it. And the 3 R's, rights, resources, representation, and the D stands for diversity, will be the key cornerstones of the cornerstones. A feminist foreign policy where gender-sensitive human rights will be taken seriously cannot continue with an arms export policy to authoritarian states, sentencing human rights defenders to jail for 30 years because they have been teetering on women's rights. Activists such as Jasmine Galas-Nazao of the Philippines state, for example, women are not primarily gun wielders. Their victimization is facilitated with the aid of these weapons. And she refers to small arms and light weapons. Such consequences of exporting arms to problematic states have been taken into considerations when we draft and support a feminist foreign policy. And only a feminist foreign policy and a truly restrictive German arms export policy can be related to each other. Let me conclude. Feminists are not unified when it comes to the question of violence and war. While some liberal feminists take over pacifist positions, others opt for equal participatory rights for women in the military, for example. And this only refers to liberal feminist positioning. However, the right to self-defense and resistance can be identified, for example, in feminist post-colonial theorizing. And feminists of all different variants are unified in their epistemological positionality of self-reflexivity and normativity, aiming at identifying and ultimately changing patriarchal power structures. Cornelia has already talked about it. And these power structures are related to weapons, militarism, and war. The women of Wilf already formulated in 1915 how to overcome such patriarchal structures. It can only be done through complete and worldwide disarmament. And while this is a utopia, it has nevertheless to remain the ultimate normative aim of feminist foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. Hanna, can you take over, please?
I do have a quite basic presentation. I'm not sure how to. Ours? Or it should be someone here. That's already okay. Sorry. Thank you. Hi everyone, it is an honor to be part of this amazing panel, and also really grateful for the previous discussants for outlining the interrelations between IFAR and saves me quite some time and effort. I'm also really happy that today's panel is happening after yesterday evening's roundtable, because some of the critical points mentioned yesterday gives me an opportunity to step in and to show how this might be done differently. So there was a criticism voiced regarding the Russia-centered approach to the storytelling and knowledge production. Also, there was an attempt to see for the role of the civil society within the IR and what's going on now. Also, for the connection between the society, the state, and the international community. So today I'll try to talk about Ukraine for the most part, the role of the civil society during the full-scale invasion of the home country, and also about the relation between the society, state, and the international community. Okay. And I'll be talking precisely about the women's experiences and responses to Russia's war in Ukraine from the perspective of the peace and security agenda. So I think I can skip the quick facts. I wasn't sure about the audience, so just in case, I wanted to highlight the war started in 2014. And even though currently like 13 million people being displaced are quite visible, the 1.6 million people being displaced before the 24th of February is quite a big number as well. It's more than the population of Munich and almost the population of Hamburg. Okay, so I also like to give some maps. In case you're curious to follow the developments at the front line, the deep state maps are usually the fastest one. With the green one, they indicate the liberated territories. With the red one, the territories where the Russian forces still stay. So this one was taken on the 11th of November. And by keeping the green parts of the map, we can see which part of the territory of Ukraine had been taken back, particularly with the support from the international community. And having the rest of the territory in yellowish color doesn't mean that these are the safe places. The airstrikes, they target all parts of Ukraine, and the blackouts with electricity and 40% of the electricity infrastructure being damaged is the result of that. So moving on, okay. Before actually starting discussing the topic, I find it really important to outline my positionality. Positionality is important because it helps understand why a person chooses a particular topic and the way to approach it. So there are four points I find important to mention about myself. So I am a feminist activist. I am a feminist scholar in Ukraine. Also, I am strongly supportive of the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion. And I'm also an anti-militarist, which might sound contradictory, but it's not. Before going to the topic, I still have to outline why this topic. As an activist and as a scholar, I am concerned about the prospects of having the conservative backlash or patriarchal renaissance, which is usually connected to the militarization of the societies and, of course, some structural factors related to the war. As for the militarization, it has already been partly outlined by some previous presenters, but I would like to update the term, originally coined by Cynthia Enlow and then developed by Cynthia Cochran. So the process I witnessed in Ukraine rather fits the definition of the forced militarization. So militarism as an ideology is a set of values and ideas that depicts the world as a dangerous place with lots of enemies around, and therefore opts for a need to have a strong army to protect the state, and consequently having these strictly divided gender roles of the male defenders and women be protected, the victims. And the militarization is the process that stems out of the ideology that usually leads to placing the military to the core of the social life, military as an institution. So thinking about military, producing culture about military, investing in the military. In the case of Ukraine, this is quite something that has been happening, but then it is a forced one. It's not that much of a choice, as from what I can see. And at the same time, we do encounter already some more related structural challenges. So we have huge level of unemployment, and economic crisis in general. Some plants, factories are just severely damaged. If we get back to the map of Ukraine, it's some of the big ones.
Because we have a presentation for them on Zoom. But
So Azokstal, one of the biggest ones, it was occupied and destroyed completely. Some of the others were placed in the Kharkiv region in the north and east of the country. So there are structural reasons for that concern. Yeah, okay, now it moves. I'm still here. And the concern of mine, which might not be happening in practice. So there is an ongoing debate if actually Ukraine falls under this usual developments. That the concern of mine is that we might be seeing the essentialization of gender roles, so attaching women to the private sphere, possess something that's already mentioned, and men to the public sphere. Feminization of poverty, of course, because of the huge levels of unemployment and labor market being distinct gendered. Increase of gender-based violence because of women being not being given the space to voice the concerns of their experiences and being attached to the private sphere. And of course, increased care work because the care facilities are also targeted. And in kindergartens and schools, they are damaged, they are underfunded because of the war. And sometimes people would just, parents would opt for keeping the children at home because it is safer sometimes. So this is the concern, which might not be translated into the reality. And so based on the examples from some of the armed conflict affected countries, such as Colombia, Croatia, Bosnia, I have come to the understanding that what has to be done in order to try to make sure that the experiences of women and their leading role actually in Ukraine in responding to the war-related crisis lies in emphasizing their input, telling the stories, making sure that they are known. So this is how my activism translates into academia. Yeah, we can skip that, I guess. This is just a list of something that improves some of the gains on gender equality in Ukraine. So some of the international conventions and national norms, legal norms. Today I will talk more precisely about the women, peace, and security agenda. Why? I'm still approaching the topic. Why the women, peace, and security? I mean, sorry. So for a multiple reasons, 2 minutes. Yeah, maybe we'll perceive it as a fact. So it matters. It amplifies the importance of roles of women as the negotiators, as the actors of change, but also emphasizing that they might be the victims. By the turning points, I identify that as in the realm of the women, peace, and security agenda. I have noticed that Ukrainian case, in particular, with the attempts to update the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security within, while amidst the full-scale invasion, and this is what we have been doing, something remarkable, something that has drawn a lot of attention to Ukraine. But what made it a turning point is precisely the full-scale invasion of Russia. I have attempted to speculate why the Russian case has been largely invisible to women, peace, and security and feminist IR scholars prior to the full-scale invasion. And my assumption is because it somehow is really uncomfortable. It falls out of the regular distinctions of North-South, Periphery, West-Northwest, where is Ukraine? And also it presenting quite a peace dilemma, something that Simon has addressed. So we have just 2 minutes, but yeah. I was trying to be helpful. Here is Ukraine. Germany also has National Action Plan, a framework for the implementation of the women, business, security agenda. We actually have 2 by now. The second one being updated. And yeah, we only have 2 minutes, but this is the question I was trying to address in the first place. So what have been the women's experiences and responses to Russia's war in Ukraine, and how they have been translated in the process of the update? Some of the sub-questions would have been what have been the gender roles of women in Ukraine? What main factors have enabled the update of the second NAP the challenges on the way to its implementation, and of course some suggestions or recommendations on how to facilitate that, and eventually promote or support the women equality, gender equality movements and attempts in Ukraine. Actually, I did some data collection, so it's a pity I can't present it thoroughly, but maybe I move on. So as for the roles, briefly outlining, victimhood and agency are strict categories. Usually, it's a lot more. It's an interconnection of both, and it's been translated in the experience of the displacement. These are mainly women who live in the country, who get displaced within the country, and you can imagine it's quite a challenge. They are largely the victims of combat-related sexual violence, so this is the long-term CRSV. Of course, also men and children, but predominantly women. Women in prison become heads of the household, so they have to make decisions, including about the economic development of their decisions of their families. They not only do humanitarian work, they lead the humanitarian response in Ukraine, which is something remarkable. At the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, international organizations, they left the country. And so the local women-led organizations, they were locating people, distributing hygiene products, medicine, etc., including to the occupied territories. And then the military stories, of course, the remarkable presence of a number of women in the armed forces of Ukraine is something to talk about. It's approximately 20% now, and some of them are involved in the battlefield work. Importantly, this has been a result of a campaign by the civil society. So there has previously been a ban on women occupying certain positions, combat positions in the army. And so the women veterans, together with sociological researchers and some media people, we launched a campaign called Invisible Battalion, and eventually the ban was lifted. So that was the beginning of the civil society. Regardless of how you might perceive the presence of women in the army, this is something to amplify because this has been a result of their work. Okay, so the NAPs, we have two. Second one being updated. What's important to mention is that both have been initiated by the civil society. And they have a good potential of having high impact. Okay, so I had some interviews and there have been lots of findings, but these are the two core ones. The first one is quite surprising. It might not sound surprising, but I will outline why it surprised me. So the update of the document has been enabled because of the ongoing efforts of the civil society towards the implementation of the women's security agenda. Why? So the obvious need to update the NAP stemmed presumably after the full-scale invasion. This is what my assumption has been. The interviews show that it has been a result of previous reports being prepared in February. As early as in February, it was known that there was a need to update the map. And so when the full-scale invasion happened, they already had the data to supply that. And they, based on that data, they organized some other events to collect some more thoughts on what new challenges have emerged. And later on, they were able to promote the updating process with the support of the government. So the second point is that the established cooperation, having the reference point, having the governmental commissioner on gender equality issues on our side, on the side of the civil society, has promoted the change. And moreover, I was part of the updating process, and we had quite some governmental representatives, so even in the defense, security, defense sector, from local administrations involved. So this is important to mention. So we can skip the updating priorities. Well, the challenges are quite obvious. They could be obvious for some. So there is unrestricted ability to do long-term planning. So having a plan means that we have like some time upon which we have to implement certain activities, but it's not quite certain what could be done and where, because the situation is quite dynamic. Lack of legal control over the territories temporarily occupied. Obviously, a government cannot implement some policies in the territory that it can't access. Lack of political will needed for effective adoption of the updated NAP. A good example of that is that we're still waiting for the final document. We were promised to have it by November, and so initially I was planning to discuss the document, but we're still waiting for that. I only have a draft. Well, generally there is lack of understanding, and so the ongoing work of the civil society lies in, holding lectures, having meetings, and just discussing why it's important and what it means. to have the VPS agenda. And of course, lack of funding, particularly in war-affected state. And the issue is distribution. So that's the final one, I promise. My answer in a nutshell would be to act to perform an act of solidarity, which, in my understanding, lies in being curious, so learning, asking for the local knowledge, and also, when possible, supporting the cause. So with the funding, with information, with networking. And as for some concrete steps, well, of course, first one is the continuous support for Ukraine in resistance to the Russian invasion, because this is how we would be able to access the territories and the people that are part of the national action plan but are not accessible. Also, the financial, informational, and context assistance, particularly with relation to informational, educational work to address the political will, but also the localization work to make sure that the plans, the local plans, there's the big one, and there are local ones at the regional levels, and local plans are supposed to encounter the context-specific challenges, because Ukraine is quite big. You have seen it on the map, and the regions, they have quite different needs by and large. So localization is supposed to target that. Platforms for civil society and governmental representatives from Ukraine to be present, to talk about the issue, to make sure that the world knows about what's going on, to learn from others as well. Humanitarian aid, I mentioned that women lead the response. However, they are not included in decision making, so they don't have much say in how the distribution happens. They do the work, but they don't decide how it's done and in what numbers. Reconstruction of Ukraine, we do have the recovery plan for Ukraine discussed this summer in Lugano, and there is an explicit component on gender equality and diversity, but having it stated on the paper doesn't mean it will be enacted in any way. So we should stay attentive to that one, ask if this pillar is being addressed since we have it, or maybe supporting its implementation. Oh yeah, and the last one was supposed to be a provocative. I guess we can skip that. I already took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will just stop presentation. Yeah. Okay. I had asked to go last because my assumption was that a lot of good things would be said before me, and then I wouldn't have to go into some of those details and could stay on a more general level. Because I think there is still confusion about what feminist foreign and security policy actually entails, why we need it, and then also maybe to how to apply it in a specific case. And I think Hanna has just given us some good ideas for how that might happen. And I think it's important to note here that so far it's been actually pretty terrible in terms of the international response and the European Union or other actors, NATO, etc., actually taking their their obligations under agreements like the whole WPS agenda seriously and actually pushing for those. So it's been pretty terrible, really. But why a feminist foreign and security policy? And I put those two together because before I started looking into feminist foreign policy, I was just a security scholar. And then I got a phone call after Sweden said, "Oh, we're going to have a feminist foreign policy." And they asked me what that is. And I said, give me a day, call me back tomorrow and I'll tell you. That's quick. Yeah, kind of, sort of. I mean, like, okay, kind of figure out. And of course, nobody knows. But here we are. A couple of years later, Sweden no longer has a feminist foreign policy, so we can talk about that too. But why would you want to declare a feminist foreign policy? I think that for feminist foreign and security policy, I have 3 points I want to make on that. So one is about feminist insights and why they are important. One is about feminist questions and what are they? And one is about feminist solidarities. So if we take feminist insights to start with, feminists have a number of areas where I think they are contributing sort of significantly
different insights that, of course, link up with various other critical and non-critical insights in the disciplines of international relations, security studies, strategic studies, war studies, wherever you might find yourself located. I have now morphed into a war studies professor. Who knows what the next thing will be. So these feminist insights concern continual violence and continua, plural. These are temporal, these are spatial, these are also conceptual, public, private, etc., paying attention to the whole span of violence and how violence is, has long histories. Yesterday we had a paper on sort of historical traumas and also stays with the body politic, travels across space and time in different ways. Feminists, I think, also have given us, not necessarily in the discipline of international relations, let's admit it, we're not so great, but maybe in sociology and in other related subjects, a lot of insight on the impacts of violence, on its fundamental destructiveness, right? So that violence produces always more problems than it solves. So it should really always be the last resort. But also, I think feminists have allowed us to think about how violence is made and unmade. I think the work of Carolyn Nordstrom here, for example, is quite interesting, right? So it's not just about recognizing the destructiveness, but maybe also how to think about unmaking it. Feminists, of course, have long pointed us to the genderedness of institutions and practices. Our first papers, and whether we are thinking about foreign policy, about war, about security, and the whole strand of the sort of relationship between militarisms, plural, and masculinities, plural, and how they interact, that is mentioned a couple of times already, I think is another aspect of that. And if we want to take feminist peace research, yes, that is also a thing. Some of us have been trying to recover. We also have the sort of more normatively oriented insight that there is no peace without gender justice, right? So if we take those insights, that's quite a lot, actually, I would say, and there's a good argument for bringing those into foreign and security policy, with the caveat, of course, that many of the insights of feminist scholars are actually focused on people, on the everyday, the bottom up, etc., versus foreign policy and security policy, which for the most part remain state-centric and or in the service of the state. So that's a big conundrum, I think, for feminists more generally. Feminist questions. Where are the women, right? That might seem like such a simple question or such an old-fashioned question, but actually if we ask it, and if we ask it seriously, and we start to talk to them, then we actually get somewhere, right? Because now we are realizing that, you know, whoever we might think are women might not see themselves as women, right? Whoever we might talk to as women might actually be connected to all kinds of others, right? Women, men, non-binary, etc., etc. So once we actually take women seriously as women and their multiple locations in their own perceptions of the self, the question becomes much more difficult. And side note here, Margot Wallström, who was, of course, the Swedish foreign minister who kind of came up with this foreign policy that we are now all continuously catching up with, insisted when I talked to her that for her, this still remains the question that gets people talking, because once you start to ask, right, okay, so this is your foreign policy issue, where are the women? How does it affect them? What is happening? You actually start to get somewhere, and it's easier in a way, easier than to say feminist, but that's a whole other question. Feminist questions also are about how is this sort of whole foreign policy apparatus, the security apparatus, the war system gendered, right? So this is another question that is a little bit more remote from where are the women? And of course, what is happening in the everyday? What is happening locally? Who is saying things already, right? There is a long history of Ukrainian feminist engagement with a lot of these things. We should not be saying anything about Ukraine and feminist foreign policy perspective on Ukraine without a Ukrainian. So I'm very happy that our panel at least has achieved this. Thank you to you and Simona, actually. Here I think the sort of lived experience, the local lived experience is also always an important feminist question. And I want to thank you, Hanna, for also mentioning the economic consequences, because those are often forgotten. And post-war changes in economic system, that sort of disaster capitalism that often swoops in. In the case of Ukraine, we have huge debt that Ukraine has, that also we have some recent changes in labor laws, which are adversely affecting women. So there are other things that need to be taken into account. And I think what the feminist perspective offers often, partly through the question of where are the women and what is happening in the everyday, is a combination of all these factors, so that we don't have one panel on board and another panel on sort of the weapons distribution, or sort of the effects of violence on women's bodies. But we try to put them together. The third aspect that I mentioned is feminist solidarities. I think that there is kind of in feminist approaches more generally, of course, a recognition of shared oppressions, and again, multiple shared oppressions that are, of course, intersectionally shaped, right? But they are also sort of shared in a way that they go beyond sort of the kind of things that we see when we just focus on states and actors that we normally focus on when we're thinking about foreign policy or security policy. And the second part to this is that in response to particular crises, for example, like the war in Ukraine or other crises, one of the things that feminists have been fairly good at, I would say, not all feminists, not all the time, etc., is activating international networks, working with civil society organizations. And I have to say that I think, at least my experience is that this has increased manifold through new technologies, through also sort of lessons learned during the COVID pandemic. I mean, we're having a hybrid panel right now. It's quite easy, honestly, to bring in a sort of local activist via these kind of media. There's no excuse, really, to have talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. So these are all things that I think feminists not only have already been working on for decades, they are very good at them. We are very good at them. So then feminist foreign policy, I think, importantly, is not about replacing all other foreign policy. Nobody ever said that, right? Though at times, some of the things that make up traditional foreign policy probably have to be replaced when you take a feminist perspective seriously. But at minimum, feminist perspectives complement or maybe refocus what is important with regard to foreign policy. And here we have a sort of shifting of maybe, to a more normative approach, I think, like mine was mentioning yesterday in the opening comments that you made. So I think that when we think about what does this imply with regard to how Germany, Europe, NATO, etc., should act towards or with regard to the war in Ukraine right now, and all of the things that I've mentioned need to be taken into account. And I think Hanna gave us a pretty good sense of, what do we need to look at? What are the women doing? Where are they with? Who are they with? Where are they not? Who are they caring for? What things are they getting or not getting, right? And then also really push those actors, right? Whether it's the German government, whether it's the European Union and its various attempts, or NATO as well, to really take their commitments under the Women, Peace and Security agenda seriously, which is not enough by far. I think a lot of feminist scholars and activists have been criticizing the Women, Peace and Security agenda because it doesn't go far enough. It's very basic minimum, but we can't even get that one right in the current conflict. So I think that this is really, really important, and also to think about this not just in Ukraine, but also wherever Ukrainians are now. A huge issue is people displaced to Poland, question of reproductive rights, right? So, you know, Ukraine and Poland are very close to each other, but they are miles away in terms of how, you know, women are treated and what rights they have. And also to remember, and this is a lesson learned, I think, from some of the other regional feminists, and I think this is another kind of networking that's really become quite important between the sort of former Yugoslav states and the whole sort of Eastern European community and Ukraine, where a lot of activists from those regions that have been affected by the other war in Europe that we had recently, that people conveniently forget, are sort of pointing out that they are seeing some of the same kind of structures and patriarchal bargains that were struck with nationalists then happening also in Ukraine, and that these kind of things will have a huge impact as we go forward. And therefore, it's important to think now during the war, we don't know when it will end, already about what lessons could be learned from other regional and non-regional, other regions, maybe even in the world, about the ways in which all of these things that I pointed to in the beginning get forgotten so quickly when we have these masculinist militarisms that we see, right? And even, yes, I know, even the picture that you showed about, you know, Zelensky's potential alternative masculinities, right? I mean, we are still seeing a militarized masculinity, etc. So we need to be, I think, vigilant and careful to think about that. Stop there.
Thank you very much for the interesting paper and the insights. Now I will give Victoria the word to discuss the paper.
Yeah, hello from me. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, cool. I'm sorry that I cannot be there. I'm actually sitting on another conference in Austria right now, where we were also discussing gendered inequalities, global gendered inequalities, but it's nice to be here. Because of time, and I think because Annick has already summarized a lot that has been said just now, I'll just keep very short so we can allow some discussion and questions if this is right. We wanted to have some time to discuss too. So I think, to me, what all these four papers or presentations are actually highlighting is that feminist perspectives and research can be applied to all different levels. So we have to apply them to questions of how we research, what theory we use, how we evaluate theory, but also then seeing our own positionality, and also to evaluate what kind of violence, what kind of gender inequalities work in specific contexts. And also, I think what is very important, that is a big discussion on when we talk about German politics, what is happening here in our discourses, how gendered they are, and what are the challenges for feminist civil society. And solidarity came up quite a few times in the different speeches. So questions applying this feminist perspectives to questions of militarism and militarization that are quite at the center of some of the discussions. So I think we have showed, this panel has showed how important it is. And as Cornelia pointed out, how we have missed this. And I think I want to place a general critique on the still peace and conflict research or international theory that's still ignoring gender perspective very much, and it's still sidelining it and marginalizing, as this is the only panel on this conference with feminist perspectives, I think. And critical gender scholarship is still something that is not taken for granted, but it's always an add-on in peace research. And we're only seeing now much more a narrative about it. And it is also due to political reasons of Germany having announced a feminist foreign policy that research in that area increases. And I think this is a criticism to the field itself, that we should have pushed for it before, to understand how, and Cornelia talked about this a lot, how masculinities work in international politics. And I do not want to undermine decades of feminist research, but I think it's still not not in the center of our attention. So just maybe key points from all 4 presentations show that when we talk about gender, it's not only about women. It is about gender as a relational idea. So I think Cornelia pointed out very well how masculinities play an important role, and how masculinities have to be seen in a transformative way. And also how we are researching about masculinities has to be context specific. And I think a lot of feminist research has shown that there are so many variables and different forms of masculinities. They need to be applied in the specific context that we research it. One of the very striking points, what we can learn, I'm very grateful for you, Simone, to highlighting is how we can, as feminists, talk about being anti-militarist, but at the same time, support the Ukrainian resistance, also their armed resistance, and supplying them with arms. And I think this is what has been missing in the public narrative, also in German context. And when we are in the peace movement is it's either pacifist or it's not feminist. And you brought together these really important points of how we can have a discussion about it, so nuanced and so important, so that we can be truly in solidarity with the feminist civil society in Ukraine and the resistance to this imperialist aggression. I think, you very good pointed out, and that connects so great to Hanna's presentation, how anti-militarism is still, we cannot lose it out of sight, but it cannot be a dogma in our work, in our feminist work. And how also talking about militarization, and I think, Hanna, you pointed out so greatly how it is not something that can be seen in one way, but it has also to be deconstructed, the many different layers it implies. So I'm very grateful for you also talking about your positionality. I think this is also a power imbalance in our panel, and I think it's always interesting to see who has to point out their positionality and who doesn't. So we are 4 German speakers and Central European researchers, and we have 1 Ukrainian feminist with us. So I think this also implies how we have to practice this in our daily lives as researchers too. And finally, I think, Annika, you already gave this great oversight about what it actually means to have these feminist questions, to apply it in research, and how many challenges they also come. And these kind of challenges, I think, are so important in this panel to be talked about, but with this great solidarity and cooperation, we can overcome what restrictions are being placed on us, on like foreign policy and security policy that's non-feminist, but also on research. I would like to pose 2 last questions, and that I've been thinking about also from Cornelia's presentation. Is like we identify states as manly and patriarchal institutions. So to me, what is still a paradox is how can we expect manly and patriarchal states to actually pursue a feminist agenda and a feminist foreign policy? How do we as feminists, and maybe you guys, you have an answer to that, can practice feminism, a power critical feminism? And the second one is, does actually feminist foreign policy work, while we have seen from Hanna's presentation that women in Ukraine are actually working with the women, peace and security agenda as a legal norm that has legal implications also, compared to feminist foreign policy that is just another Western approach. So do we maybe focus on the wrong issue, but rather talk about how we can support the women, peace and security, and how does it fit together in a Western centered feminist foreign policy? So these are my 2 questions that came up thank you so much for all of your really, really great presentation. I can only be very grateful to have been able to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Before I open the floor, I would like to give a chance the panelists to answer the two questions, which
should we have that open and then wrap up on the end?
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what.
Okay, so I was old. Okay.
I'm Konrad. To complete the first family a little bit. And I really enjoyed all of these talks, and thank you for putting up this panel. It's been a great one so far. And I want to pick up a point Annick mentioned, and also Victoria, and that's the one of context. Like really put local context, but also kind of consider the past and really see what specific challenges Ukrainians maybe face in terms of gender roles and gender-related issues because of the past they have had. So all of the violence that has happened in the last, let's say, 100 years, 150 years. And there's some great research really showing how this also shaped the picture of masculinity and heaviness on women, special, like really special developments, which also kind of gives, for me, some sort of explanation into the picture we saw. So I just, want to put this into the room and maybe ask all of you, or one can pick it up. Do you consider it? How do you consider it? And how do you put it into context?
Thank you very much. I think there's Elvira Rosa.
Thank you. Elvira Rosa at Universität Hamburg. Thank you very much for the interesting panel. What I understood through your presentation, and it wasn't that clear to me before, is that the effects of this war on gender relations are highly ambivalent at the moment. So we cannot really tell where will it go, because we can see clear indicators of both. So we can see a lot of kind of progressive and transformative signs. For example, that Ukraine is much more liberal towards flexible gender identities and has a much more liberal and active LGBTQI community. We can see Zelensky as a different leader than Putin, for example. We, from time to time, see also Ukrainian female soldiers represented in the media. On the other hand, we have all the other things that are very traditional, things that we could have expected, like refugees who are leaving predominantly women and children, in force with the Ukrainian policy of not leaving the men and not letting the men leave the country. We have also pictures of Ukrainian soldiers who are represented in a very traditional way as tall and strong fighters, right? And we have rape that is mentioned in the context of war, this war frequently, but usually equated with female victims, and also leaving out the whole other sexualized component that may also target men. So I think it's just interesting to observe where will it go. Maybe you have an idea, so you guess what we will face in terms of transformation of gender relations through the lens of this.
Can I take another question? Or okay. So
Thanks, Cornelia from the University of Hamburg. So I like all four papers very much, and I'd like to touch upon something that Cornelia Ulbert, I was also looking at your paper, which is online while you're presenting. So I like very much your post-materialist take to try to establish some new knowledge by looking at visuals, which is also one of the objectives of standpoint feminism, post structures, feminism, and so on. So I think that's a very important epistemological endeavor there. And so you look especially at the nexus between masculinity and nation, which I think it's important to understand how norms are used as instruments of building authority. And I was wondering how that's, the question is addressed to you, and also Hanna, perhaps you also like to say a few words on this because you touched on this in your presentation. So how does conscription plays out into this? Because we have seen in the context of the war in Ukraine, conscription vote in both in Ukraine and in Russia recently, but they were only for men. So if we look at conscription from a military service perspective and from a nation service perspective, conscription is about the idea of defending the nation. And if conscription is compulsory, and we also see that in many countries in which conscription is compulsory, it's usually compulsory only for men. So it's only very few countries, I think, in which conscription is compulsory both for men and for women. So how does this relate to the idea of defending the country and the idea of nation? Thanks.
Well, I have at least three others. Is the question, will you answer now, or will we collect still other questions? Rather collect? Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 in the middle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi, Konrad, University of Bayreuth. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really not well versed in feminist research, so I'm really a beginner. I've been dabbling a little bit in social reproduction theory because it's an intersectional field that's coming into the intersection between capitalism and patriarchy. So I would be curious how you, as feminist researchers, would describe the implicit theoretical commitments that you pursue. Because I think Carolina, for example, was now mentioning standpoint theory and constructive feminist theory. I wasn't really clear to what extent in your 4 interventions there were in the background different sort of theoretical approaches, because feminist is a really broad field. And since many of in the room, I am very much a beginner, I would be more able to work with it if I had more understanding of your theoretical commitments.
Thank you.
I'm curious whether you'd be willing or interested in making that a little bit more explicit.
Thank you very much. We have to speak a bit louder because I have the feeling that not everyone is following online. So it's your question and louder.
Yeah, Sebastian Hoppe, FU Berlin. I want to pick up on the ambivalence actually, and I want to say that having one leg in the area of studies, actually these Putin pictures are much more ambivalent than they seem to be. So and because of course this is hypermasculinity, and actually scholars of authoritarianism or even of fascism, Alexander Motyl and others, they have put the hypermasculinity very prominently in their own theoretical frameworks when they speak about Russia. So this is not really something, I would say, this is not an insight by feminist scholarship, but where I think feminist scholarship might contribute. And I would be really interested in what you think about that, because I'm not an expert on that. But I mean, you have in Russia these campaigns, Yani Bayuskazat, so where women speak out or spoke out a couple of years ago against rapes and everything. And on the other hand, there's actually a female constituency to Putin's rule. I mean, there are women voting for Putin, and I guess it's because of such pictures, at least to some degree. So how can we make sense of this ambivalency from a feminist perspective?
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Larry Hesse, representing Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation in Ukraine. And my question will go to Simone Wysotsky. So we do see that when a country faces an act of aggression was, hard military force, the only way to actually protect it is to have weapons to fight back. And at the same time, the presentation addressed bans on weapons exports, and how does that play out together? Because you cannot stand up with your open arms and love against weapons.
Thank you very much. Okay. Now it's a problem. Simone, will you answer first?
I'm very sorry, but I didn't understand the question because it's like underwater here. So the sound is really, really bad. So the colleague, which I couldn't identify, please, could you pose your question again? As I said, I couldn't hear.
I'm gonna come closer to the mic. Sorry. Is it better now? Anyways, sorry. My question is, we saw the importance of having actual arms to defend when it comes to an unprovoked act of aggression with actual weapons, and how does weapons expert ban play in this whole framework within the feminist foreign policy perspective?
Okay, I mean, so yeah, you relate. I mean, we have two problems. On the one hand, you have the right to self-defense, yeah, and this implies, of course, to defend yourself with weapons. And I think you relate to. I mean, there's no weapons ban. You relate to the Arms Trade Treaty. Could this be?
No, the export ban. Export ban that you referred to in the presentation.
Oh, okay, the export ban. No, there isn't an export ban. I mean, I asked, or I think the German government currently is designing an arms export control law. Yeah, and this has to be, this should become a restrictive arms export control law, and particularly related to authoritarian states, for example, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, who lead war in Yemen, for example. So, and as I said, I think it's the same, two sides of the same coin. Yeah, you have the rule-based order, which is engraved in the UN Charter, Article 51, and on the other side you have rules, for example, enacted in the Arms Trade Treaty, that weapons shouldn't go to problematic states who lead wars or violate human rights, humanitarian law. There are all sorts of criteria. Also, when states commit conflict-related sexual violence, and I think these are basic rules. And with a feminist foreign policy, these rules, for example, in Germany, should be widened. Yeah. So, for example, when human rights defenders are imprisoned, for example, these states shouldn't receive German or even European arms as well. I stop here. Hopefully I could address your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to give you a floor.
I try to tackle various questions with one I try to answer at least what you asked me. So the various questions centered around what do you make about manly states, patriarchic states, the notion of hypermasculinity, and it's the contradictions and ambivalence that is enshrined in it, or goes along with it, and also this question of conscription. I think what you can see, as I said at the beginning of my talk, was from a feminist perspective, you wouldn't use the notion or concept of hypermasculinity to explain the behavior of an individual. So, but you ask what are the causes and especially consequences of it. So, and I think this was great that you said there's this female constituency to Putin's rule. In fact, he's got a real fan base, especially with young women. And I really recommend reading the book of Valerie Sperling. But why is this the case? And why is this the case? I think we've got a kind of impression why Ukraine is different, because there were, on a political level and on a society level in Ukraine, there were years of trying to change gender roles and empower women, and this wasn't the case in Russia. This is why he still got the women fan base.
And this is also a question of conscription. So why do we have just compulsory military service for men and not women? Because women are the ones who reproduce and are the ones who then finally secure that the nation will survive. That's the difference, and that's the problem. I think Hanna tried, and she did it also, tried to show what happens now in times of war, because she talked about the backlash that happens in Ukraine now with the militarization, because then you fall back on the traditional gender roles again. And this makes it so, and I think that Hanna will talk about it, I guess this makes it so hard for Ukrainian society, because there's this tension now in the society amidst war. And this is really challenging, and I think we have to keep it in mind for us. And again, how to follow feminist foreign policy within a male patriarchic state. I especially took the quote of Kagan because, at least in the 1990s, he looked upon Europe as Venus. And what I wanted to imply with this quote is there are also regions or states that might be Venus, that might use cooperative means. And we had a panel this morning when we talked about nuclear power plants, and the presenter said, there's no legal framework. But you can only come up with a legal framework when you negotiate a legal framework, when you cooperate on a legal framework. So it's not only militarized times of war, it's also you have to cooperate, and then sometimes you have to be Venus. And maybe in the long run, it's about changing societies, and then also our image of what we would like to have our nation to be might change. It's a process of social and cultural transformation.
Thank you for all the questions. I'll try to answer some at least. I'd like to start with a statement I should have said in my presentation. So I think it is important to understand that war only deepens the already existing issues. It's not like the war started, the invasion of Ukraine started, and we got rid of the poverty, xenophobia, and like all the bad things. It doesn't work like that. And so there are some issues, but I did not say that there is a backlash happening. I said that the theory says usually a backlash is to be expected. And so my point was to stay cautious. I am supportive of resistance because I see no other way to preserve the gender equality achievements, but this is the contradiction we face because the people says, the other cases says it might lead to the backlash, but I mean, what choice do we have? It's quite different from like having the image of the enemy and having like the real maniac behind the door knocking and trying to kill you. It's really different. So this is why I said forced militarization. Okay, then addressing the question about why I support Putin in Russia. Well, my answer would be really simple. Not all women are feminists yet. And yeah, I guess I'll move on to the conscription question. Conscription is the price for the privileges. Throughout the centuries, men have been entitled to better jobs, having expected to have leading roles, etc. Assuming that that's because they are smarter, faster. In case of emergency, they will be defenders. I mean, it's not to say that in Ukraine women didn't do that. In Ukraine, women voluntarily joined the military service. This amount of women, like 50,000 women, who were fighting for their right to occupy the combat positions. They did it voluntarily, and they have been accommodated. Of course, there are some issues still ongoing. I mean, like we are launching this civilian campaign on suing the proper uniform to fit the bodies, the female bodies, and we do kind of hygiene products because what government provides is not quite suitable, etc. But I mean, it is a process. Democracy is a process, change is a process. Okay, then coming to the, oh my God, Victoria asked a really difficult question. She does it all the time. This is why I like her a lot. We are colleagues. So how the manly and patriarchal state could practice critical feminism. Okay, well, to begin with, like state is an oppressive structure, but we don't live in an ideal world. We don't live in a stateless world where like we live in communities, all function in a horizontal way. We live in a nation-state world, and nation-state world. It's better to have a state if you are surrounded by the state. I mean, the Kurdish resistance is one example. Palestinians might be another one. I'm not sure if this is the place to talk about this one. So what matters if the state has democracy, democratic order, because democracy offers you, us, me, the civil society, the tools to fight for the rights. Yeah, as my easy supervisor used to say all the time, like we do what we can. I mean, we will use whatever tools we have, and we would make sure that we have more tools, that they are more effective, and that we will always be there to answer the questions and make sure that they are answered and or at least taken into account.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to be super brief since we're over. Yeah, the old time, which of course is not a strength, right? At the moment, okay. I wanted to pick up a couple of things. So, feminist theoretical commitments. Feel free to read my book, but yeah, written a whole book about it. Yeah, so that would take forever. But you know, critical infrastructure risk, etc. And yes, there are different perspectives and they do matter, but I think all of the things I pointed out are actually, you know, maybe common no matter what approach you have, except for maybe the intersectional bit. Because some feminisms are very essential in their understanding of women and gender. And so then that becomes an issue, right? So are you arguing for the inclusion of women in militaries based on their essentialist traits, right? They are somehow more peaceful, etc. Then that's a slightly different and highly problematic, I might add. Read my next paper coming out that way of doing that. So I think that it matters, but it might not matter as much in some of the things that were said today and in the argument for taking feminist perspectives seriously. I also want to pick up the question of where is the sort of gender identity thing going now? It seems to be going all over the place. That's very normal. We know this from feminist research on various conflicts, that actually oftentimes wars open up lots of opportunities for women, men, and others to take up new roles simply because there is an openness in a way during wartime. One of the things to watch here is, of course, the militarization, potentially the forced militarization, and it's interesting that you know there was all male conscription and the sort of ban on men leaving Ukraine, given some of the gender gains that were made previously. The opening up the Ukrainian armed forces have higher rates of women than pretty much all the other European ones. So yay us for being so gender progressive everywhere else. And I'm talking also about Sweden, which is like, oh yes, we're so gender progressive, but yeah, the numbers lie actually in Sweden. So Sweden counts also all its civilian women who are working as secretaries, etc., in the armed forces as part of their gender numbers. So I'm not giving away too much of a secret here, but you know, it looks much worse than it looks officially. And at the same time, Sweden likes to train everybody else in being just sensitive, but yeah, it's fun. So I think that things to watch out, of course, is this masculinist militarism and what it will do. I think the disaster capitalism that is you know, inevitably maybe following, and also the sort of post-war, what happens when the war ends, right? Most of the time when the war ends, these spaces close down significantly, and so that's also
a concern in terms of supporting feminist civil society actors now to be ready then, right? However one might do that. Oh, there's so much more I could say. I think one more thing to what Victoria was saying, the WPS versus feminist foreign policy. Let's be honest, whatever goes for feminist foreign policy, as far as states have adopted it, is mostly WPS. So it's not actually that different. What I was presenting was sort of quote unquote what a real feminist foreign policy might actually look like, as opposed to the one that Sweden had, the one that really is borrowing from Sweden, or the one that most other governments, and not giving away maybe also too many secrets, but Finland is currently considering one which might actually be more interesting than what we've seen so far. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Yes, we are over the time. I thank you all for your patience and for the interesting questions and for very, very interesting input you have given. Yeah, I wish you a nice Saturday and yes, we want the